The topic is the tax system and urban development. And he will share the result of his research on the spillover effect of urban transportation infrastructure. This is the first presentation by Mr. Suzuki. And second presentation is by the Dr. Erik Vergel-Tovar, Assistant Professor, Universidad del Sur Andes. He is Erik-san. And his presentation title is the rail-based systems impact on the urban spatial structure. Is it right? Thank you. And he will share introduce the case study of the Colombia as an example of how property tax and other tax revenue can be returned to fund public transportation development. And this first one and the second one is a kind of the brother the research jointly conducted by two of the guys, Suzuki-san and Erik. And these two, the research is addressed to a relative urban development. And the third presentation is by Dr. Ray Asada, research fellow, JICA Ogata Research Institute. And the presentation title is Does the tax system contribute to rural sustainability? And Dr. Asada will introduce the case study of Sri Lanka, where the government subsidy have contributed to sustainable rural development. I just talked to rural. So that the third presenter is addressing to a rural development, not urban development. And after the three presentations, 15 minutes each. And after that, I'm very happy to have a quite eminent scholar as a commentator. I'd like to introduce. And the first commentator, Professor Ada Jansen, Stellenbosch, the University of South Africa. Thank you very much. And the second the commentator is Hiroshi SATO, a Chief Senior Researcher, Institute of Developing Economies in Japan. Thank you very much for your participation. And after the comments by the two the scholars, we'd like to have a 20 or 25 discussion session. And then I think I will make some common question to three of the presenter, and then I'd like to open to the floor. So 1.5 hour session. So I'd like to start. And then, so Suzuki-san, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear. Thank you, Chairman.
Yeah, he's joining from the Tokyo, Japan, not Tokyo, the suburb of the Tokyo. So Suzuki-san, would you start, please?
Okay, thank you, Chairman. So let me start my presentation. My presentation title is a research on the spillover effects of urban transportation infrastructure. So as a background, we JICA is conducting a lot of the urban transport master plan in developing countries. However, the finance is the greatest challenge of urban transportation in developing countries. For example, this figure shows the main proposed urban railway project in Lahore, Pakistan, urban transportation master plan. The cost for the only selected priority project in the master plan is over $6,000 million US. So sometimes the priority project proposed in the master plan is not implemented due to the financial burden. So what is a possible financial source and revenue for public transportation? And governmental fund, ODA loan, PPP finance, and fair revenue and non-fair revenue, and subsidy, etc., etc. And one of the important financial resources, fair revenue, but this is negatively affected recently by the COVID-19. For example, this figure shows the passengers in transportation in Indonesia. You can see that the passenger of the car has recovered from the COVID-19, but on the passenger of the number of the passenger of public transport is still low level, has not yet recovered. So additional new financial selective financial resources is wanted. So in context, this research proposes as a finance with a spillover effect as an additional option. So what is the spillover effect of the urban transportation? If the urban transport has been developed, the surrounding area, I call it affected region, the private investment and also the property development has been occurring. We call it the spillover effect, and that just will result in the increase on the property tax revenue. That could be the potential financial source. But these usually go to the general budget account, so does not return to the urban transport. So this research proposes to measure this spillover effect and use for the urban transport itself. And I would like to mention spillover effects are expected to continue occur even after the opening of the urban transport, which is different from the user charges, user fare, because a user fare is usually the stable after the opening of the urban transport. So this finance with spillover effect is expected to boost the financial sustainability of the urban transport project. And the examination of this spillover effect, finance with spillover effect should be at the earlier stage of the project because a transport project has a long project cycle from the transport master plan, feasibility study, design and construction, operation, and also the implementing the finance with spillover effect. Maybe I need a consensus building for this among stakeholders. And also, if necessary, legal arrangement should be done. So consensus building for the use for this additional tax revenue and also related jurisdiction arrangement at earlier stage is a key. So in this context, this research has three components. First one is conduct the case studies, the confirm the feasibility, apply this idea. Using the case of the Medellin, Bangkok, Kuala Lumpur, three cities. And second component is measure to the spillover effect is a case of Medellin, Colombia, with land other cadastral value data. This will be explained in the next presentation by Dr. Erik, the University of Los Andes, Colombia. And based on the first component or second component, finally, we are going to propose a sample workflow to examine the spillover effect as a potential financial source in the future urban transport master plan as an option. So today I will explain the first part and the third part. So let me briefly explain the result of the case study. First case is Bangkok of Thailand. We contacted the Ministry of Transport and the Ministry of Finance, and the Ministry of Transport showed agreement with the idea of the finance with spillover effect. However, the Ministry of Finance showed a different stance. That they said that disclosure of the detailed property tax data may not be accepted due to the risk of the exposure to the economic and social disparity of area in the city. Second case study is Kuala Lumpur, Valencia, and we also conducted the Ministry of Transport and Ministry of Finance, and they showed also the difficult stance about this idea. Since Malaysia is a multi-ethnicity country, the equity among different ethnicities is highly sensitive. So disclosure of this kind of the detailed property tax data may not be accepted due to the risk of the exposure economic and social disparity area in the cities. Third case study is marriage in Colombia. That is a totally different stance from the past two case studies. We contacted the Medellin Metro, a public transport company, which is a close relation with the city council. They kindly provided us the detailed land value data, and also they showed high interest in increasing non-fair revenue, including this spillover effects. And also there's cross coordination between the Medellin Metro Transport Authority and also the Property Tax Authority. And also generally, there is a social consensus of the tax on the tax revenue redistribution from rich to poor. So the case study, the result of the case study suggests there is a diverse view on the property tax itself, including the availability of the disclosure, etc. So the finance with a spillover effect is not applicable to all cases, but applicable to some cases. And also the important thing is the same stance between the transport authority and tax authority on the spillover tax use into urban transport. And also institutional basis on the redistribution of the spillover tax revenue into urban public transport is a key. So from now on, I will introduce the sample workflow of examining the finance with spillover effect in the urban transport master plan. At first, you need to confirm the detail of the property tax data, including frequency of data update, data coverage, data mesh, and ease of processing. And also you need to check how much does it reflect the market trends. Here are the key challenges in the implementing the finance with spillover effect in developing countries. That is a maturity of the property tax systems. Existing literature shows, broadly speaking, there are two types of the property tax in the world. And many developing countries applies the area-based approach, which tax rate depends on the location, use, and the quality of building, not the land value. On the contrary, most developed countries value-based approach and the assessment of the capital value taxable property. In the context of the finance with spillover effect, our linkage between the land value and the property taxes value is important to capture the uplift, the land value due to the public transport. So enhancing the property tax systems in developing countries is one of the key challenges. Second step is confirm the property price and property tax systems, including the maturity of the system, which I explained now, and as well as the restriction of the publication of the data. And step 3, you will set an indicator of the spillover effect in the target project. For example, several % of the difference in the property tax revenue before and after opening the transport. Step 4, you will focus on the potential financial resource by a spillover effect. And step 5, to examine the operational and institutional schemes to return potential financial resources, which includes a target of use of financial resources, the management entity, and coordination framework, and case of multiple parties, and legal basis, etc. There is a second key challenges to implementing the finance with spillover effect in developing countries. That is a coordination scheme between tax department and transport department. I mean, the case of the Bangkok on the Kuala Lumpur shows if the transport authority and the tax authority is different ministry, maybe the coordination between them is relatively difficult. But as a Medellin case shows, there is a cross coordination between them, or under the same umbrella, under the same government or city council, there is a transport authority tax revenue or something. It's easily coordinated. So the coordination scheme is one of the key challenges. Step 6 on the economic and the financial analysis of a priority project incorporating a spillover effect. So calculate financial rate of return, FIRR, the project that incorporates a spillover effect. Step 7, that is a proposal for policy measure to maximize the spillover effect with equity consideration. So for example, there's the last the key challenges that is designing the property tax system, including how to distribute its revenue to promote equity in urban area. That is one idea or one example. If we set the target area for the spillover tax revenue only highlights urbanized area, and the spillover revenue from these high-rise urbanized area could be redistributed the slum and informal settlement, I mean the lower income area that will lead to the upgrade and formalization of this area. This kind of formalization of upgrade of informal settlement or lower income community will lead to the future increase of spillover revenue through network effect, because the transportation is a network. So one of the part of the city is improved, maybe the effect will be distributed entire the transport network. So that is finally conclusion. This research proposes new optional financial concept with the spillover effect to enhance the sustainability of urban transport. And the key challenges are the enhancing the maturity of property tax systems in developing countries, and also coordinating schemes between tax authority and transport authority, and how to design the property tax system to promote equity in urban area. Lastly, the international development institution, including JICA, could play an important role from the master plan stage to tackle above challenges with developing countries. So that's all of my presentation. Thank you for your attention.
Oh, thank you very much, Suzuki-san. And yeah, claps. You can hear the claps.
Yes, I can hear. Thank you so much.
That's great. And you kindly share not only the theoretical of the framework, but also the quite practical step to bridge the academic issue and the action on the ground. Thank you very much. So let us move to the second presenter. So Erik, please.
Thank you very much. But I think we are only looking at the presentation in this computer. Okay, good. Okay, hello everyone. My name is Erik Vergel from Universidad de los Andes in Bogotá, Colombia, and I'm going to share the case study of Medellin and the impacts of the mass transit system on the cadastral values in the city. This research project was presented at the Transportation Research Board TRB annual meeting in last January in 2022. I worked with Suzuki-san, who already presented, and we had Paulo Martinez as a research assistant, and Julian Muñoz provided support in JICA, Colombia. So I'm going to discuss these 6 points in order to explain the background of the research, the findings, and then we're going to have some discussion, conclusions, and policy implications. So the first point is to look at 2 theories behind the effects of transportation systems in the urban spatial structure. The first one is looking at how land prices are going up when you are close to the central business district. And once you go down in the curve is when you are moving towards the periphery. So according to the land use and rent theory, we can say or assume that land prices are going up once you are closer to the biggest activity nodes in cities. And when rail systems are implemented, this curve might change. According to this graph, we might assume that around the stations, land prices are going up because the accessibility benefit. So accessibility benefits, as you see here on the right side, might impact property values, and property and land values are going to change faster because probably property owners are going to try to capitalize land rents according to the accessibility benefits generated by a transportation system. But we can also expect some redevelopment changes, which means land owners might seek to increase the floor area ratio, to have higher densities, to have the buildings with higher floor area ratio, trying to capitalize also the accessibility benefits. So these are the impacts that we can expect according to the theory. And therefore, we have a concept that is transit-oriented development, which is basically how we can have the accessibility benefits as a way to promote compact cities with land use mix around, especially the transit stations, trying to move those who need the transit closer to the system with the promotion of affordable housing close to the mass transit stations, and also to reduce the amount of time, travel time for those users, and also to reduce travel distances in cities by promoting this kind of compact development. So according to the evidence and the theory that we have, we can say that land values are not only based on what you have in the parcel or the plot of land, but also what you can do in that plot of or land parcel. So land values are basically related to how much you pay for what you have in terms of location, but also to what extent, how many, for instance, built up area you can promote, how many floors you can promote in that parcel. And according to the studies in the United States, those transit stations that are more pedestrian friendly are showing higher land values, which means that the property, the real estate market is trying to capitalize those areas where you have high quality pedestrian environment. So we're talking about not only what you can have in your land parcel, but also the kind of environment that you have in the public space and the access to different kind of facilities. According to the multilateral agency, And we also looked at how there is an increase of commercial land uses close to the metro system in Medellin between 2007 and 2017. In the case of the light rail, we also observed that there is a gap or a difference, and we have here a parallel trend, which is important in this research. But after the light rail began commercial operations, we also observed an increase in terms of the cadastral values. The changes on land uses are not as big as they are in the case of the parcels served by the metro system. And in the case of the cable car, the parallel trend is similar up to 2017 or 18. And here we're talking about informal settlements, which are part of a regularization process, formalization process, and upgrading policies. So we assume that probably because those policies take a lot of time to be implemented, probably the change is taking place only at the end of the study period. So what we found is premiums between 3 and 14% in those parcels served by the metro system. We found that after the opening of the BRT and the light rail, there is a positive effect in the entire network, which is an important finding. Suzuki-san already talked about this, which is basically once you expand the metro system or the mass transit system network, you can expect not only effects on those parcels next to the new metro line or new light rail, but also to the entire network. And that is why we looked at, in a study visit, in a fieldwork visit in Medellin, we found these new developments that are taking place next to the light rail. And here are developers trying to capitalize the accessibility benefit. And therefore, we believe that if you have in a city a high-rise building like this one with a mixture of land uses, commercial on the first floor and then residential, there is an opportunity to capture land value increments, given that you have more property owners, you have more residential units, and therefore the city has the opportunity to capture those changes. In terms of the light rail system, we found 4% premiums for those parcels next to the light rail system. And there is another interesting finding, which is in the case of the cable car. Here there are pictures of the stations and the kind of environment you see around the cable car stations. We found only premiums of 2% in the year 2019, but there is a significant change in terms of densification. Houses or residential units next to the stations are increasing densities, and we assume there is no evidence to date, but we believe in the future we might be able to measure how residents in informal settlements are trying to densify, increase densities, and increasing the number of households per housing unit, because it's going to be more expensive to pay for those locations next to the cable car stations, and therefore we believe it's important to take into account this unintended consequence in terms of densification. So just to close, the conclusions is that we found effectively changes in terms of cadastral values for the metro system, and these findings are similar to the studies that were conducted in cities like Chicago or Seoul. In the case of light rail systems, we found premiums between 3 and 4% in the case of Medellin, which are similar to the findings of in Manchester and Cuenca in Ecuador. And in the case of the cable car is up about 2%, the premiums that we found in the case of Medellin. So there are some policy implications. The first one is that the expansion effects mechanisms to capture those land value increments. So we believe that it's important to undertake future studies, not looking at the cadastral value or the assessment of the land value, but also to the property tax revenue, to try to understand to what extent cities are really capturing and how much is the revenue that every city is able to generate based on the assessment. And in this point, I want to highlight the importance of conducting the appraisal values every year. Medellin is not doing that. So I think it's important for cities to keep up to date the cadastral value and the assessment system every year. And finally, as Suzuki-san mentioned, there is an equity issue, and we discussed this in terms of if you are having informal settlements receiving the benefit of mass transit investments, it doesn't make sense to try to capture those increments in those areas, but instead trying to find cross-subsidy schemes in which probably high rent areas might cross-subsidize those informal settlements in the future. So I think it's not easy to try to apply the value capture mechanisms in the entire network, but also to take into account the social context in which you are trying to apply these mechanisms. And with this, I close my presentation. I want to express my acknowledgments to JICA in Colombia and in Japan for their support, also the metro system in Medellin for their support, and the planning department in Medellin as well, and the people who provided all the support in terms of access to the data that allowed this study, that we conducted this study in Medellin. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you very much, Professor Eric, and for your detailed explanation of the Colombia case. We came to understand the big potential of the spillover effect. So third presentation is a bit different angle, and she focused on the rural development with a case of Sri Lanka. I think I like it quite unique, I think. Please.
Thank you very much, Makino-san. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for coming to listen to this kind of early morning session. My name is Rei Asada. I am a research fellow at JICA Ogata Sadako Research Institute, so we have a quite long name. My background is the field of public policy and development studies, particularly on Sri Lanka's unique rural-oriented development path. So today I'd like to talk about the distribution of public expenditure and the rural development using Sri Lanka as a case study. Let me explain the motivation of this study. As many of you are aware, it is globally accepted that there is a correlation between economic growth and urbanization, and that as economic growth, populations are concentrated in urban areas, and the cities continues to grow larger and larger. Accordingly, a World Bank report states that no country has ever become a middle-income status without experiencing rural to urban population shift. However, the ever-expanding cities pose many problems: environmental pollution, spread of epidemics, lack of urban infrastructure, etc. To solve this problem, the SDGs set out of the proposition of sustainable cities, which is not about preventing urban expansion, but about but about how to sustain cities. As this figure shows, the higher the per capita income of a country, the larger its urban population. On the other hand, the low-income countries are not yet urbanized and have larger rural populations. While the majority of countries are taking measures to balance urbanization and economic growth, here is one country that has experienced economic growth but is anatomically with regard to the typical urbanization growth pattern, that is Sri Lanka. Sri Lanka became an upper middle income country in 2019, yet 80% of its population reside in rural areas. This is another figure that illustrates a global trend while Sri Lanka is behaving very differently. The composition of Sri Lanka's urban and rural population has remained virtually consistent for over 130 years since National Statistical Survey were begun. This is a very unique phenomenon compared to the rest of the world. What is mysterious is that Sri Lanka has been able to maintain a significant rural population for a long period of time without urbanization. So today I'm going to explain how and why the country, which has achieved some modest economic growth, has been able to achieve this with a focus on distribution of tax revenue and the state expenditure there. I am very aware that many of you are too busy to wait for the conclusion. So to begin with, I will briefly introduce the three main factors that contribute long regarded Sri Lanka as a success case that has achieved high social development despite being a low-income country. Around the 1980s, Sri Lanka's achievement in improving poverty rates and meeting the basic needs of its population attract the attention of researchers and international organizations. These achievements in basic needs are highly recognized, with Amartya Sen and others referring to them as a Sri Lanka model or outlier. However, Sri Lanka's high reputation in the field of social development has instead focused the international community's attention on the stagnation of the economic growth. The absence of a rising urban population has been labeled as a failure of growth without looking at the reality of the situation, as it is not in line with the traditional growth patterns. The main reasons for Sri Lanka's dismal outcome can be summarized as following. Number one, the financial resources were dependent on exports from the plantation sector that did nothing to develop the local industry. The second, number two, the government prioritized the public distribution over growth and was heavily biased toward welfare expenditure. The stagnant growth rate that fallen to 0.7% in early 1970s, the government finally prompted to embark on a large-scale economic liberalization process in 1977, and to move away from decades of protectionist policies. The policy shift helped the Sri Lankan economy to recover, but the intensifying ethnic conflict that started in 1983 posed a major obstacle. The conflict continued for almost 30 years, increased the military expenditure until 2009. The third group is a criticism of Sri Lanka's political system. It has argued that Sri Lanka's economic decline described on the previous page was the result of political failure and not economic, Sri Lanka's economic decline described on previous pages was the result of political leaders' failure to link national policy with appropriate political strategies and not the economic policies itself. This criticism focuses on the peculiarities of a political system owned by a small elite group. Elections whose real purpose was the elite struggle for the privilege focused on the rural areas where the majority of the population lived. The elite actively expanded welfare to increase their popularity in rural areas rather than economic policies. Accordingly, those groups tended to favor the Sinhalese, the country's ethnic majority, in order to secure their position and hide their insecure financial base. This also led to the outbreak of 30 years of ethnic conflict. Let us look at how these political regimes have made public investment in social welfare. Sri Lanka has invested nearly 50% of its public expenditure in welfare policies and is widely recognized as a welfare state. The financial resources used for the public expenditure have long been dependent on the tea plantation sector, which is a legacy of British sovereignty. Instead of protecting the local dominated coconut and rubber industries with low rates of taxation, the government earned foreign currency by imposing high rates of taxation on the tea industry. These particularly tea industry dependent financial resources were used to implement welfare policies. I should emphasize, by the way, that these welfare policies were not specific to the rural areas, but cover the whole country, including urban areas. I will quickly and briefly look at these policies. For the government in the immediate independence period, alleviating the poverty and inequality brought about by colonial rule to the rural population was a matter of urgency. Food rationing was initiated just before independence, and subsequent poverty alleviation programs contributed significantly to poverty reduction by ensuring that people are well neutralized. The government also provided free health care and education, making it available to all throughout the country. It is important to note that these were not only free, but that schools and medical facilities are located everywhere in a fairly equitable manner. People received basic medical service and free schooling and were able to access these facilities within their local communities, greatly reducing the pressure to migrate to urban areas in search of these services. Moreover, the bus transportation played an important role, providing access to employment, healthcare, and education, and as an essential part of the maintaining the dynamism of the society. The government developed a vast bus network in every corner of the country and maintained low fares through subsidies. Even taking into account with their living standards, bus fares are by far the cheapest. It is also guaranteed service on an uneconomical rural route and facilitated intra-regional and regional urban travel. Inexpensive, extensive coverage bus service also increased the people's choice and in turn improved education and healthcare itself. This democratic and never sophisticated or the first bus transportation provision not only reduced the need for people to look for employment opportunities in the cities, but also made it possible for people to commute to work every day. This is the chart of the mechanism of welfare policies and rural sustainability. First, when these welfare policies were actually initiated, they were planned and implemented in pieces. There was no universal plan for their synergies. More precisely, the government did not intend welfare policies to sustain the rural population or prevent urbanization, but simply to build on the rural first principle. The instability of the country's political system played a role in this spontaneous mechanism. Party politics, which at first glance appears confrontational and unstable, was in fact responsible for the long-term stability of welfare policy. The conclusion is thus the long-term public investment in welfare policy contribute to the sustainability of rural rather than urban development. Let me conclude by highlighting some of the learnings that can be observed from the Sri Lankan case study. The first is the long-term government intervention. Usually, as a country develops, it has been recommended by international organizations, including JICA, to reduce government intervention and let the private sector develop and the market grow. However, Sri Lanka has followed its own path and continued government intervention rather than following these recommendations, and has instead succeeded in sustaining rural rather than urban-oriented growth. Importantly, rural people are to some extent satisfied with the rural life. And often, as nation grows, donors and policymakers tend to push for the development of high technology, high-speed transport infrastructure. Sri Lanka was different. Instead of introducing new such transport infrastructure, they focused on maintaining the transport that already exists. Bus transport, which was user-friendly and democratic for the people, was a way of life for them and enabled them to sustain their existing way of life. Given the excessive urbanization is a problem, doesn't the Sri Lankan experience provide an opportunity to think about whether it is really a case to be criticized? Several studies have also demonstrated that these Sri Lankan welfare programs have not had a significant impact of the financial collapse of the state. With the world concerned about Sri Lanka's default and once again pushing Sri Lanka as a failure case, I think what I talked about today makes you feel a little uncomfortable. However, the fact that the impact of the default has been more damaging to urban life and rural life has held up reasonably well gives us much to think about. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Asada, to share the unique case of Sri Lanka, focus on the rural development. Thank you very much. Now we have two commentators and to address the presentation. And Professor Jansen, please make your comment to first and second presentation as a spillover effect, please.
Thank you very much. Thanks very much for the invitation to make some comments and a few remarks on the first two presentations. But firstly, just to thank all three speakers for very interesting papers, very interesting comments on the way to use the tax system. And I will specifically comment on the tax system implications, as I'm a public economist, public finance economist. So that is my specialty. So I'm not a transport system expert, but I will definitely try and give you some comments to work with. Okay, but maybe just to start with the problem as identified by the speakers. I mean, what we've seen in the past 2-3 decades, we have seen a decline in public expenditure on infrastructure, and we've also seen, obviously, public investments declining. So I've just sort of took some data that I've sourced from a recent World Bank publication indicating that on average, what we see is that your lower income to lower middle income countries investing less than 2% on average as a percentage of GDP, on public investments. So that is quite scary in terms of developmental objectives. And so there needs to be some focus on finding alternative ways, to finance public infrastructure investment. And this brings us to the papers that were presented. Specifically, the first two looked at the spillover effects and how that can be a financing option, specifically within the urban context or urban city context. And so from my perspective, it's an undisputed fact that infrastructure investment can increase employment. It is a stimulus, a very powerful stimulus for economic development and social upliftment. Developing public infrastructure does definitely have a positive spatial spillover effect. And this is something that one, in terms of the papers discussed here, we've seen that there are definitely ways that one can actually benefit or take some benefit from this and, you know, create further investment opportunities. Maybe just a few comments on the spillover calculation that I would like to sort of comment on, but also perhaps the speakers can then, you know, address in their comments later on. They've indicated that the early calculation is very important, particularly if you want to, you know, invite potential private investors on providing information on the kind of return that they would be able to obtain from such large investment efforts. And the question I would then want to pose to the presenters is, how do we operationalize such investments and sustain this type of investment funding based on, you know, quite a lot of fluctuation in property tax systems? And I'll talk later a little bit about specifically in the African context where I'm from. I'm from South Africa, and so I know a little bit about our own property tax system, but also within the African context. And I would like to then obviously raise this as a discussion point for the presenters. And so if the property tax system is not well developed, right, how do we sort of, you know, still operationalize this, framework that you have put on the table? I've seen from the literature, I've spent a bit of time just looking at some of the literature, because it's not my field, but what I've seen is obviously the methods that have been applied, specifically that you have now applied in the second paper, the difference in difference method, using the land values as your sort of as your dependent variable. That obviously has been picked up in quite a lot of the literature. I'd like to also perhaps ask something about the hedonic pricing model and whether that was an option that you would like to consider, where you actually then make use of the property values to show that kind of spillover effect. In terms of the aspects for consideration within a developing country context, if I just want to make one or two remarks on the data and the method. So first and foremost for me, your data accessibility and the quality of the data is of utmost importance in this case. If you want to specify a premium, then obviously it needs to be calculated from values that are accurate, that you have accurate information on those property tax revenue systems and what flows from there. Also, what you would need is, in all of these areas where these upgrading and investment will take place, you will need to have these systems in place, and that's not necessarily the case. So that obviously will, deter from applying all these steps that have been indicated. And even if you do have a property tax system in place, there are still some issues that I think that one needs to give attention to. So one, that is the status of the local tax system. If we think about different regions with local governments, especially, how well developed those property tax systems are. And we know that there are differences between urban and rural property tax systems. Our urban areas would obviously have more developed property tax systems, and you would then be able to work within those regions and develop and calculate your premiums. However, with that said, one needs to also consider that even within your urban areas, you will also have other aspects that need to be taken into account, such as how efficient is your institutional framework to collect property tax revenues. So institutional and administrative capacity plays a vital role in the success of calculating and in implementing and operationalizing these this type of funding model. Yes, the local and spatial development of these urban transformation systems in developing countries may then constrain taking this approach further. So one needs to think about, yes, normatively this is how one can implement, but how do you actually in practice take it forward, especially given these constraints that we are facing. And we have some papers in the African context that you can have a look at that will give you details on the efficiency of tax collection. So a lot of work has been done by the ICTD, the International Institute for Tax and Development, they've done quite a lot of work on Africa and the property tax systems and factors that contribute to the efficiency or determinant of efficient tax collection. Then obviously the nature of the projects that you are thinking of in terms of infrastructure, it's long-term nature, and that has implications for your funding models. So if, within a long-term framework, how do you actually fund and how do you obtain investors with this kind of project? From an economist perspective, there's obviously the earmarking that takes place in terms of funding, because here we are specifically thinking about using the funding for a specific purpose. And so that's something that has implications. Using earmarking as an instrument also has implications for your budgeting process. This is something that needs to be taken into account when you think about your priorities within different regions. And so this is definitely, it does have positive effects, but it can also deter your processes and determining priorities for future budgeting purposes. And then I think finally from my side, and both of these, well, I think all three speakers spoke about this, but specifically then in terms of what I have to comment on, the distributional considerations. I think this is obviously very important within a developing country context. If the focus is then on locations where the benefits of the spillovers are not maybe too large, it can have a disincentive effect, or it may mitigate the sort of positive effects that spill or that is derived from these kinds of projects. And so you will have to find optimal ways to address the redistributive question. And as I said, if the focus is on the property tax system and investments are primarily then within the urban context, then one will have to think about how that is going to impact your redistribution objectives as a government. So I think that those are the comments that I'd like to make on the two presentations. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Professor Jansen, and have a very significant and sharp comment on the question. It could be very tough for us to respond all. But would you quickly, please, Erik, respond to that?
I want to express my acknowledgements to our colleague, the Professor Ada Jansen, because in fact, I wanted to ask you if you can share your slides with your comments, because we are preparing this paper for submission to a journal. So if we can get additional feedback before the submission to the journal, that would be fantastic. Well, I think that these are extremely good comments about the study that we made. In fact, there is no still evidence about any city in the world that has been able to use property tax for funding of public transportation systems. So here we are talking about something that is not yet, let's say, implemented. So these suggestions and comments are extremely useful if we want to move forward with these ideas. So basically, I forgot to mention that in our study we did a hedonic price model with a difference in difference research design. So we are implementing that approach. But I completely agree with the challenges of having property tax systems that have accuracy data, that you have the assessment of the land values with the information that is up to date, and how to manage those kind of data is extremely difficult. In fact, in the case of Medellin, it was very difficult to get the data. We had to talk to the cadastral department, the planning department. They were reluctant to provide the data. They said, we cannot give you the names of the property owners. We have to give you only the land value data and the attributes of the land parcel, but we cannot give you names. So it's difficult to find cities where you have those kind of efficient local tax systems. I completely agree with that suggestion. And I also think there is another challenge. I even move forward with your suggestion about the information for investors and the changes between short and long term, because to what extent you can apply land value capture mechanisms over time. In fact, we don't know yet if the accessibility benefits are going to be for the entire period of the implementation of the transportation system. So that is also part of the discussion, the moment in which you can really capture the value increment and to what extent you can apply that over time. So I even would add this difficult discussion. And in fact, sometimes we can capture the land value increment with the building permits, and that happens only once. That is easier to apply, but the property tax system is more difficult to apply it because we don't know in which moment you can really observe and capitalize the benefit. So I think these are very important topics and questions, and I think the main discussion behind this is to what extent we can take advantage of land as a source of revenue for public transportation, and not only to increment values for property owners and to provide the benefit to the private sector, but also how the public sector can benefit from a public investment, which is probably the discussion behind it. So I leave it over there, but thank you so much for your comments.
Yeah, thank you, Eric. So next, please, Mr. Sato, make a comment, please.
My name is Sato Kan, and I'm a development sociologist, so I'm very interested in that third presentation, Asada's presentation. So, but we don't have much time, so I only comment 2 points. One is the urban-rural relation. Well, she mentioned about the Sri Lankan case. Usually, the industrialization and the high-income development come with urbanization. But in the case of Sri Lanka, it's not. So urbanization, without urbanization, Sri Lanka came to a middle income status. That is rare. And this is a kind of the happening, maybe by chance, but I think that for the whole planet, nowadays we are suffering from the over-urbanization, excessive urbanization. Then Sri Lanka is a kind of hope. If Sri Lanka is continue to this way, well, that could be very good. So that was the starting point of the presentation, I think. And then point is that the next, please, a tax issue. I'm not the specialist on tax, but listening to her in the presentation, something come to my mind is that, well, in Japan, for example, we're highly urbanized, and the rural area is depopulated. A kind of desertification. It's a calamity nowadays. So, but this is the future of all other cities, I think, so the countries. How to save this point? And then nowadays, Japanese government is try to tax, and then almost all are coming from urban area, and then distribute to the rural area. That is the politics. But the case of Sri Lanka, the main resource mobilization point was plantation. It's a rural area. So rural area plantation, the resource, and then they can distribute to rural area. That's okay. But for the future, we can continue that. Maybe the question, next please. Question is that, what she mentioned about the value of rural life is still continuing in Sri Lanka, but is it sustainable for future? And then even though, is there any enough job opportunity in rural area that we can expect that the people still living in rural area? And if not, then the government, is that possible to absorb the tax from the urban area and distribute to the rural area? That could be the future challenge, but still, I think that the case of Sri Lanka is very, very, well, kind of hope. And would you please back one slide? This is one case of the Japanese case. In Japanese, the rural town in Kamikatsu is a one-tenant area. And then the population over the 65 or more than 54%. Can you imagine? More than half the population is more than 65. And that is the future of all the planet. Then when we, JICA, brought the Bhutan, the officials, to kamikaze area, because Bhutan is also respected the value of rural area. They try to keep the population stay in rural area. Okay, so what they're doing is that to keep the infrastructure good in rural area. Then in Kamikaze, well, it's a rural area, but they have the paved road, hospital, schools, everything there. So that is a kind of the ideal station for Bhutan officials in Kamikaze. But still, they had that. There is no young people there. If this is the case, what's the impact of the modernization of rural area? Picking the infrastructure in rural area. No effect. That is a challenge. So I just want to ask Asada-san, well, what is the future of Sri Lanka?
So please.
Thank you very much. It's a very, very tough question, and I always think about what he has said to me all the time. So the value of the rural life in, well, Sri Lanka actually has really, really positive perception toward rural area. This is not only from the rural population, but also the urban population like kind of praise and think that rural area is a kind of place that they want to be. So this continued until today. This is not the past. So the school children learn about how this rural life has been like, well, kind of beauty of the country. So they learn about it, and they still keep the value that rural life is wonderful, like rural is the place of the development, the center of the development of the country. So this kind of promotion is really effectively worked in case of Sri Lanka from the historical perspective. But on the other hand, when the country grows, usually that rural area will be considered to be kind of, well, not the place people want to live. So government provide a pull factor in the urban areas to invite people to reside in urban areas. But in case of Sri Lanka, rural area had a pull factor for the people to live. Instead, urban area has not have any pull factors. So urban area still is not attractive enough to the rural population to move. So I don't know whether this was a kind of plan that the government did not create pull factors, attractive, urban as maybe planning in urban areas. So this is a question, but somehow it is working up to today. Well, about the job opportunities in rural areas in Sri Lanka, it is not that people are working for the agricultural sectors. So the participation for the agricultural sector is kind of quite low at this moment. So what people do is, there are plenty variety types of jobs, but it does not create a lot of, well, cash like incomes. They have kind of different types of jobs which provides a good enough money to survive. So it's not enough, but they can continue living in the rural areas. So this is another perspective that maybe relate to the Buddhism itself, that they do not seek for a kind of better life. They only think about, well, I survived today, I may survive tomorrow, but they do not think a lot about next year that I will become richer and richer. No. So they are satisfied, but this quality of like life and how they think about development is very different from what we think, that kind of Western, countries. So this, I think we have to admit the value of life, and Coming back to the job opportunities in rural areas. So up to today, they are okay. They survive. They could continue living in the rural areas. But I don't know the future because of this current situation of the Sri Lanka. They have fallen into the default. So people suffered a lot. But I can emphasize that people, suffered a lot more in urban areas, and rural people they suffered, but the level of sufferers are less in rural areas, and urban areas suffered a lot because they need cash to survive, and they need a lot of facilities to access. But rural areas, no, you don't need to. So that's what I could say now. Thank you very much.
Now we thank you very much, the commentator and the presenter. We now just completed the commentator session, and I'd like to open the floor. And according to the secretariat, we have to complete our session by 1:30, so 10 minutes or something like that. So please raise a hand, and would you introduce yourself, and then which presenter you'd like to address? Yeah, please.
Thank you. My name is Riatu from University of Indonesia. Actually, I would like to know the context of the, I think this is from the first and the second on urban infrastructures. This is the case of like land value captures or betterment tax. Mostly is adopted at the developed countries, but I think I agree with the discussion in developing countries, even the property tax system, that maybe the valuation and the administration is still much below the optimal context, and whether you foresee that it is true it needs specialized, I mean like special type of tax, or just concentrated focusing on the property tax system, especially in urban area. I think much that can be captured from that. And also in the context of previously for the case for Indonesia, there is like the diagram that's showing that the cars is actually increasing, but the public infrastructures is not quite pick up during the COVID-19. Maybe it is also related to tax relief to the car, the new cars tax, I don't know, the luxury type of tax and the VAT relation. And also in the context of the public infrastructures, there are restrictions on that though. So taking into account of that, and then the context of the period itself, to actually comparing, is it in the context of when like the cable car is operationalized, or when it is also like especially on the LRT is also constructed. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Also the one or two, yeah, please. And the final.
Thank you. My name is Barihu. I'm from Sardi. Two quick questions. The first is on the presentation, the second presentation from Asada. The Sri Lankan case seems quite unique, as you rightly put it. I was wondering, does it have to do with tax structure? For example, do they have very punitive tax system? You know, the tax that punishes the urban area and then rewards the rural area. Do they have that kind of punitive measures, or even other discouraging policies that forbid the urban area not to develop, and then in favor of the rural area? So it might be helpful to look into the tax system and other things. On the first one, with Erik and Suzuki-san, I was also wondering if your works have looked into the issues of distribution of the spillover effect among key stakeholders, particularly among the state and the private sector. So issues of distribution, of the premium. Thank you very much.
Yeah, please. But I'm sorry that quickly make a comment.
Thank you. I'm Umi from Indonesian National Research and Innovation Agency. To Ms. Asada, it's interesting, but I want to ask about the mixed policy mechanisms. Policy mechanism between fiscal policy and monetary policy, because in Sri Lanka currently has high inflation until 70%, and it surprised me that the high inflation, but they still keep the rural condition, yeah, and also their philosophy, as you mentioned about, and how government can maintain about the mixed policy mechanism between monetary policy and fiscal policy. And second, for Mr. Suzuki, yeah, it's just if we take Indonesia as example for the JICA support for IMRT phase 3, how the spillover can be accounted if the government has changed the policy mechanism, because currently Indonesia will move the capital city to Borneo Islands, which is Jakarta is already very concentrated, and maybe it cannot create more, maybe the value will be reduced because of in Jakarta will be not a capital city again. The risk is how to contain this risk. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. All very significant, sharp. The question and the comment. Thank you very much. And we have some time constraint, and though the question addressed to the Suzuki-san, but on behalf Erik-san first, and then the Asada-san, try to the response to the comments in the question, please.
Okay, thank you for your questions. For our colleagues from Indonesia, I wanted to let you know that we conducted a recent study or a literature review about transportation systems in the world and impacts on land values. And we realized that even though Jakarta has the Transjakarta, the bus rapid transit, and more recently the railway system, there are no studies about the impact. So my first suggestion in the case of Indonesia would be try to collect evidence. I think it's more important, this is what we did in Medellin first. First, to try to look at to what extent there are really impacts or spillover effects. Now that we have the evidence from Medellin, and I would suggest to do the same in Indonesia, for instance in Jakarta, then you can realize to what extent you can really capture those increments now that you have the evidence. And I would say that even though if the property tax system is not well developed, it's important to be aware of the positive or the impacts that the systems are having. Otherwise, is the private sector the one who gets the benefits. So if you are looking at property values and you see the property owners are receiving the benefits, that is a good message for the public sector, because urban transportation projects are public investments, and as a society we are investing on them, and if only those who are receiving the benefits are capturing the accessibility benefits, we are having, in my opinion, difficulty in terms of how to get the value increments for the society as a whole, and not only for those who are close to the infrastructure. So my suggestion is, yes, even though property tax systems are not well developed, we need to construct the evidence so that policymakers and decision makers become aware of these impacts. It's my suggestion. And in the case of the opinion, the question about the spillover effects in Medellin and the reaction, I don't know from which country are you coming from, but that is an important question, because when the light rail system was under construction in Medellin, people complained in the city council that their properties were receiving such a big impact, and therefore the values of their properties were going down in the market. And people were trying to stop the project, and several citizens went to the city council of Medellin trying to stop the light rail system project. And now that it's operational, people are starting to redevelop land because of the accessibility benefits. So what I'm trying to say is probably the reaction of the public depends on the stage of the project. And given that light rail systems require a lot of space in the road design, because the transportation system is on the surface, you need to provide some kind of resettlement policies, land acquisition policies, and trying to reduce the risk of displacement of population. So in that case, I would say that it is important to take into account that difference in terms of the timing. Yeah. And I would close on that because I know the time is short, and Asada-san is going to respond to the questions.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you very much for questioning my case. So about the tax system. So yes, Sri Lanka's tax system is not well developed. I mean, I could say there is like almost no tax system yet. They are developing it. They are collecting the tax from like general publics, but it is like they are trying to reduce taxes because of this default situation. But well, there's a lot of challenges. One thing I could say that rural areas pay less taxes. For example, there are garbage collections and there are water pipeline system in urban areas, so they have to pay. But in rural area, there is no garbage collection and the water is like almost free. The pipeline system has not well developed. So rural areas can enjoy these like facilities and difference between rural and urban areas. For these reasons, some people live on the border between rural and urban areas. So they enjoy the infrastructure in urban area, but they live in rural areas. So this is happening. So I would also look into this more into tax system, what will be happening in the future. And the problem of this high inflation, and it of course hits rural areas, but cities are more affected by this inflation, high inflations, because urban areas are materialized. So they own a lot of materials, not only in in urban cities itself, but they have more to pay in their homes. They have more electricities to pay. They have, as I said, they have to pay for the water pipeline systems. So, well, in rural areas, they have less materialized. They have less cash flows. But this is again changing in the situation happening in Sri Lanka. So I will have to look into more deeply, and I will develop in my future research. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much. And today we have a very fruitful discussion. Thanks to your the quite proactive participation. Thank you very much today. And my understanding that today's research presented on the way to finalization in the near future. So I think based upon today's discussion and comments and the question, we'll be able to further brush up our researches. So finally, would you kindly clap for the president and the commentator? Thank you very much today. And thank you very much, your secretary of the GDN. Thank you very much.